our next guest, who is none other than Daman Singh, the author of Kitty's War. She's a brilliant writer and also the daughter of the much respected former Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh. We will now play a 2-minute introductory video for Daman Singh. Please give her a huge round of applause.
I must say I was absolutely delighted. I never expected that such a privilege would be extended to me. So I'm really happy to be here among fellow writers, among fellow readers, and all of you here this morning. That video was actually made by my publisher, and it was supposed to give you a sense of what my novel is about. But I'm going to try and elaborate a bit about it. You know, once upon a time, I used to think that India had nothing to do with World War II. And a few years ago, I realized that I was completely wrong. Indian soldiers fought in World War II in battles across Africa, across Europe, and across Asia. There were about 2 lakh Indian soldiers in the army when the war began in 1939. And when the war ended in 1945, the number had gone up to 25 lakhs. You'll have to convert that into millions for the people who don't know lakhs. And during the process, during the years that the war raged, 87,000 Indian soldiers were killed. About 34,000 of them were wounded, and about 67,000 were captured as prisoners of war. So India did have a lot to do with World War II. But not just in military terms. India actually funded or financed a big part of the war as a British colony. And apart from money, India provided food, it provided material, it provided equipment, all of which was part of the war effort. Now, one of the industries which actually contributed enormously to the war effort were the railways. And in the process, the railways took quite a beating during World War II. So we have a situation where hundreds of locomotives and coaches were shipped to battle zones. We had hundreds of miles of lines, railway lines in India being dismantled, being uprooted, also being shipped overseas. Since there was a sort of squeeze on railway infrastructure, a large number of railway stations were closed to Indians for passenger traffic as well as for goods traffic. The priority in those days was to make sure that the war effort should not suffer in any way. In the process, we also have a situation where a large number of railway workshops stopped serving the railways and were serving the Indian Army instead. 1942 was a critical year in World War II. It was a year in which Britain was defeated in almost every theatre of war. It was also a year in which Japan emerged as a big threat, not just to the Allies, but also to India. Japan won strategic victories in the Pacific, and it was slowly but surely inching, or rather zooming its way towards India. So in 1942, there was a very real threat that Japanese would invade India. And this was a threat that was felt both by the government, the British government, the colonial government, and it was also felt by the people, especially along the in the eastern region, say starting from the northeastern states, through Bengal, through Orissa, Bihar as well, and down to Madras, where we are today standing. Just to give you a sort of glimpse of what that fear was like, in that year, along Marina Beach, trenches were dug and sandbags were erected to deal with a possible onslaught. And there was some sort of incident at sea which made the authorities in Madras feel as though the attack was actually about to take place. And in quick reaction, large parts of the city were actually evacuated, and in a very bizarre move, all the animals in the zoo were shot dead. So this is the kind of atmosphere that existed in 1942. My novel, Kitty's War, is set in those months, in the first half, should we say, of 1942. So it is set at a time where Britain is taking a beating. It is set in a time where Japan is possibly about to invade, and it is set in a time when the railways are under a great deal of pressure. The story takes place in a small railway colony in Bihar, what is now Bihar, called Pipli. Now, it so happens that the inhabitants of that railway colony were all Anglo-Indians. Indians, of course, were not allowed to live in the colony. So one of the families in this railway colony were the Riddles, and the Riddles play a big part in my novel. But the novel is not just about the Riddles, it is about two other people as well. One is their Aya, who does not have a name in the story. She is a Santhali tribal who comes from a nearby village. And the fourth important character in the novel is a young man, a Bengali, who is the new assistant station master at Pipli, and he happens to be the very first Indian officer to be stationed at Pipli. Now, I don't think I should tell you what happens in the book, because I hope that you will read it for yourself, but I will give you a short introduction to two of its characters, since we only have 8 minutes. Terence Riddle was, by a strange coincidence, born and brought up in Madras. His father was a salesman at Higginbottom's, the famous bookstore which continues to exist today. As a young man, Terence had no intention of following in the footsteps of his father, and he wanted a much more exciting life. And luckily for him, a distant uncle in the railways promised him a thrilling career if he joined the railways. So Terence practically ran away from home, turned his back on his family, he never came back, and he made his life in the railways. Along the way, he fell in love with a young lady called Annie. Now, Annie was an orphan who had been brought up by missionaries in Ranchi. And when they met, she was teaching in the mission high school at Ranchi. And Terence and Annie got married, and they had a child, a daughter, whom they named Catherine. But everybody knew her as Kitty, hence the title Kitty's War. Unfortunately, Annie died soon after Kitty was born, and Terence had to bring up his daughter virtually alone. And since he was estranged from his family, he didn't want to take any help from relations. So he managed, along with a series of ayahs, from one railway colony to the other. And when Kitty grew a little older, he put her in a boarding school in Darjeeling, where she studied from start to finish. Terence wanted to bring up his daughter to be fearless, to think for herself, to be able to look after herself, and that is exactly what happened. When Kitty did finish her schooling, she was a young woman with a very independent mind. So she decided that she would become a teacher, just like her mother was. While Kitty was studying in Darjeeling, she met a young boy, or a boy her age, who was also studying in Darjeeling, whose name was Jonathan. So they were sort of this brother and sister school. She was at St. Anne's and he was at St. Patrick's. Neither school, I think, exists, but I made them up. So Annie and Jonathan fell in love, and they were planning to get married very soon. So this is what happens before the novel begins. I don't want to tell you what happens after, but Just to give you a sort of glimpse, you know, Terence was a man of utmost integrity. For him, doing his duty was, you know, the supreme motivating factor. So he always did the right thing. He always played by the book. He always followed the rules. But when the war started to take its toll of the railways, when he saw how railway infrastructure was being eroded, how the railway system was being weakened. Am I 8 minutes up? Okay, 30 seconds. So he started wondering whether there was really any point in playing by the book anymore. So that's about Terence. Kitty, on the other hand, always believed that she was practically English. After all, she spoke English, she dressed like the English, she thought like the English. So for her, England was home. And when the war brought its sort of tentacles into India, into Bihar, into the little railway colony, her little world was shaken. And through the course of the book, Kitty did not really know who she was anymore, and she did not know where she belonged. Thank you.
Thank you, Daman. In his book, The Admiral I Knew, Brigadier Mike Bhalla narrates the true story of Ronald Linsdale Pereira. Mike has brilliantly collated Ronnie Pereira's amazing lifetime in the Navy, giving us invaluable information and insights not only into the Pereira's lives, but also about the Navy. To tell you more about this fascinating book, I'd like to invite on stage Brigadier Mike Bhalla. A round of applause, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm indeed honored and privileged to be standing here. And I must thank Harisa, maybe out, for giving me this opportunity to speak and share a few of my experiences with one of the most revered sons of your great community, late Admiral Ronald Linsdale Pereira, the iconic and legendary Chief of Naval Staff, Indian Navy from 1979 to 1982. I can assure you, there will not be another Ronnie Pereira of the sea. He was undoubtedly the most inspirational leader of men in post-independent India. A man of impeccable honesty and integrity. A man who had great sense of conviction and moral courage. And in normal course, the officer of such reputation would have gone home as a lieutenant commander. But God was with him. Destiny had other plans for him. He kept climbing the ladder and eventually beat the system to reach the top of the tree. I have covered this unique and intriguing narrative in details in the chapter, Admiral in the Making. My journey with the great man started on 4th August 1971, when his eyes froze on my terrified face. At that juncture, he was Deputy Commandant of National Defence Academy near Pune, an absolute terror to the cadets. Terror, capital T, underlined. And he had 1,500 cadets running helter-skelter, day in and day out, to stay out of the sight. Because if he ever give you a second look, you are in deep trouble. He stared hard at me. My heart was pounding with fear. My mouth was dry. My legs were shivering, expecting the worst from him. But fortunately, I got away. When after about 20 seconds or so, He broke his silence and he said, "Son, your face reminds me of my late nephew, Flying Officer Michael Pereira, who was tragically killed in an air crash in Hashimara, Northeast India, in 1967, and he was barely 22 years old. Being a childless couple, our relation grew, and soon a nondescript Sikh cadet, Sant Pratap Singh Bhalla, was graduated to Mike Bhalla. And thereafter, for the next 22 years, he was a father to me, a philosopher, a guide, a friend, and a mentor, a very tough mentor, but the heart of gold. During my long association with him, what really amazed me, that how a human being can be driven by so much of righteousness, integrity, honesty, propriety, compassion, and good human conduct. And that too in an environment which is totally hostile to such human values. But Admiral never wavered from his chosen path. He never compromised on his rigid principle, irrespective of the consequences. And this particular human trait, he very emphatically demonstrated during a promotion board of senior naval officers in 1981. Even before the board was convened, there was intense pressure on the admiral from the political class as well as the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Defence to clear one particular officer. But the admiral won't relent. And when the final list was put up to him, he saw the gentleman in question was way down the merit. And Admiral conscience wouldn't allow him, in spite of the pressure from the highest executive office, that is the Prime Minister office. But his conscience would not allow him to let this officer jump the queue over more deserving candidates. And he sent the list to the Prime Minister's office for ratification by the Prime Minister herself. Being a Defence Minister, she signed the list, but with a remark, quote, "I do not know what this Admiral's coterie is up to," unquote. Coterie? Out of 6 members on the board, 4 were Anglo-Indians, all men of great character. And when the file came back to Admiral and he saw this remark, he was not the one to take it lying down. He immediately sat down to give a reply because his integrity was being questioned. And he wrote that all promotions in the Navy are carried out as per the merit and in a very fair and transparent manner. All members of the board are the men of unquestionable integrity. No interference is entertained from any quarters whatsoever in the functioning of the Navy, and particularly the promotion of the senior naval officer. And he went on to justify why he couldn't, in all conscience, oblige, and sent the file back to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, when she read the remarks, she was furious. She was a very powerful Prime Minister. Nobody dared question her authority, leave alone challenge it. She called the Defence Secretary and told him, dismiss the act and find a new chief. And the Defence Secretary contacted the next man in line. He said, sorry, in the circumstances, I too will resign. Yes, he was an Anglo-Indian, man of character. His daughter, loving daughter, Donna, is sitting here. Admiral Shunka. It shook the Defence Secretary. He couldn't ask the next person because he was also an Anglo-Indian. And the next was also an Anglo-Indian. So he went back to the Prime Minister and told her, Madam, if you go ahead with your decision, there will be serious consequences in the Navy. And you will stand to lose more than to gain. So it is better to withdraw. She had a majority of absolute majority in the Parliament, and she was the most powerful prime minister since independence. But she could not touch Ronnie Pereira. That was his stature, ladies and gentlemen. The government tried to act awkwardly with him, but they couldn't harm him because he was too honest, and they didn't know how to deal with such honest human beings. He was honest to a fault. He would not use his staff car to go to church, golf course or market because he perceived them to be private engagement or private activity, and he would pay the tax. And even auto rickshaw times, as a chief, I accompanied him in an auto rickshaw to Army Golf Course, Dharakuma. I mean, that was the level of honesty. And when the defense minister of Oman came to India in 1980, he presented a very expensive watch to all three chiefs. Next day, Admiral had this watch valued and is deposited in the Tosha Khana. Tosha Khana is the government treasury. Because as per the government notification, any gift beyond 1,000 rupees has to be declared and to be deposited in the government treasury. But nobody ever did, except Ronnie Pereira, because he thought it's improper to retain the watch. And it left the other two chiefs red-faced. And to make matter worse for the other two chiefs, he very strongly recommended that there should be a joint draft proposal put up to the government stating that no service chief should be given any government appointment after retirement, so that they serve for the service, for the well-being and not for the government. This is exactly what the other two chiefs did want to hear. And they outrightly rejected the idea and admonished him because he was the junior most chief. As it is, he was getting under their skin, and they told him, Ronnie, don't speak out of turn. For very obvious reason. One went to Indonesia, 2 minutes. One went to Indonesia, and another went to France as a messenger. And both had stayed as a governor. And Ronnie Pereira, come March 1982, walked quietly to the sunset at the comfort of his small home at last, at Whitefield, with a black and white TV and a Bajaj super scooter for his transport. Absolutely unbelievable. What a remarkable human being. 1 minute more. I will never get this opportunity again in my lifetime. My book, The Admiral I Knew, is a tribute from a son to a father to spread his legacy of his greatness as a human being, as a leader. This book is primarily based on the letters he wrote to me over 20 years. 300 handwritten pages, written in most beautiful and expressive English. The art long lost and totally outclassed in the digital age. Nobody writes such letters. He covered every aspect of life, both personal as well as professional, with the underlying aim of making me a better human being and a better literate man. The book encompasses his background, his early life, my journey with him, his military, his oratory skill, his vision, his prayers of making a small home, his love for dogs and golf, accident, and finally his battle with cancer. I also touched upon his visit to MacLure 16 Cavalry in March 1980. He was the first naval chief ever to visit an army unit in 200 years. And not only that, he played baseball match with the troops and the officer team and hit a homer and ran around the 4 bases, much to the excitement of the crowd. Next year, he visited me in Sikkim to meet my young wife, a local Buddhist girl from Gangtok, and to check up with her whether she made the right decision or not. Well, 38 years hence, she's still around and sitting there and smiling. The second half of the book are the encounters they had with cadets in India, very moving episodes. and touching tribute were the officers served within 50s, 60s and 70s. And the doctors who operated upon him when he met with a very fatal scooter accident in April 1980. It happened right in front of the command hospital, main gate, Providence. Otherwise, it would have never survived. Well, Admiral must be looking down from the heavens and smiling. He may have retired 37 years ago, he might have passed on, past 25 years, but even today, he is held in the highest esteem, respect and admiration by all three services, both past and present, and particularly the Navy and those 2,500 cadets in NDA, whose young mind was impacted by his personality and the great qualities of head and heart. God bless his soul, God bless his soul. And it is aptly inscribed on his tombstone. I fought a good fight, I finished the race, I have kept the faith of Timothy. Hari sir, thank you very much once again, wherever you are. I think I've asked for a better platform,
Thank you.
and a better audience, and a better anchor. And I hope somebody someday will make a biopic on him. He truly deserves one. Thank you, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brigadier Bhala. We now move on to the next one. And can I please request when I come and stand here, that's your cue to 8 minutes. We've got another 8 speakers. And
Cut the mic off.
your 8 minutes is done. So please, to be fair to the others, I would request you to keep to 8 minutes maximum. Okay, so Blair Williams was an officer in the Indian Railways, and I'm told probably the first genuine Anglo-Indian officer post-independence. He immigrated to the US in 1976, where he worked in various managerial positions in the field of manufacturing. Blair's charity, CTR, is renowned for its exemplary efforts in helping less fortunate Anglo-Indians in India. Today, Blair is here to tell us more about CTR publications and the 7 books, is that right? 7, yeah, which is undoubtedly a well-researched work and modern almanac of the community. Let's put our hands together to welcome Blair Williams. Blair Williams.
Concept and show you how the concept is implemented. I'm not really going to discuss any individual books. So, if you just move to the next one. Yeah, so the concept was, the question was, how will posterity remember the Anglo-Indian community? When I retired prematurely, I asked myself that question. I want to do something with the rest of my life. And my answer was not very satisfactory. The community had been described stereotypically, as Glenn has said. The women were of easy virtue, the men were drunkards, who were interested in dancing and carrying on, and on and on and on. And most of the community was written about by English authors and by Indian authors. So the stereotype was being continued. And I've given you some examples of some books: Bhavani Junction, Continent of Sirs, Naransi Chowdhury, Poor Relations, Christopher Hawes, The Impressionists, Elsa, many others. So it occurred to me that what I would like to do is provide a third view, a more balanced view about the community. And that's how CTR Books was born. I wanted, my community is the last Anglo-Indian community, I believe. There are maybe a community or two in India which will follow. Certainly in America and Canada and Australia and England, my community is the last community. Our children are Americans or Canadians or Australians. So really, the community only exists in India, and that too, with the amount of intermarriage, it's gradually reducing. So before my community sort of vanished, I wanted us to record our views of how we were, how we lived, what we liked, what we disliked, and hence the series of books. Additional benefit. I wrote the first book, an Anglo-Indian green book at the bottom there, very boring, didn't bother to read it. But I donated the book to a charity that I created. And the entire proceeds of the sales of the book went to the charity. So this is an interesting way of raising money to the charity. And so every book that I published, donated it to the charity, and the entire gross proceeds of the books went to the charity. So I'm not going to go through the process. We have a process which we set up an editor. Margaret was an editor for 2 or 3 of the books. And we had judges, international judges, and we set out a theme, used the internet, got responses from typically about 150 to 200 people for each book. And they came to me by email. I stripped them of their identity, gave them a serial number, and sent it to the judges. 2 or 3 months later, the judges had decided on which 40 to 50 stories they wanted to include, and back to the editor, who then edited it, and we printed the book. The whole process took about 2 years. Yeah, and these are the books. Anglo-Indian is the first one, by me, Margaret Defoe's, Haunting India, Voices on the Veranda, no, yeah, The Way We Were. Just go through that. The next one, The Way We Are. The next one was Anglo-Indian Women. This particularly pleased me because of all the stereotypical descriptions of the community. The treatment of our women was absolutely disgraceful, the way they described the women in literature. So it gave me great pleasure to bring out this book, Women of Anglo-India, written by Anglo-Indians, non-Anglo-Indians, and giving our women their due credit and their due respect. More Voices on the Veranda, and lastly, Curtain Call, which we produced in 2015. So we had a total of 7 books in 15 years. What's very interesting is the composition of the authors. It's not all Anglo-Indians, it's fascinating. You can see each book there. I analyzed statistically where the authors came from. And you can see Australia, Canada, India, UK, USA, others now. And also I analyzed it between Anglo-Indians and non-Anglo-Indians. Equally fascinating. And so you can see that the whole series was put together by Anglo-Indians. It's sort of an oral history project that was written. And rather than do a survey, these were Anglo-Indians talking about their actual experiences. All right? And other non-Anglo-Indians writing about Anglo-Indians and the culture and the mores and their way of life. What happened in 2013, we worked and we established the Derozio Anglo-Indian Research Center in Calcutta. Major triumph. We had the Chancellor of Calcutta University reside, and we had opened up, in fact, if you go to Calcutta, go to the Derozio Research Center. They have exclusively a section of the Calcutta Central Library on College Street reserved for Anglo-Indian literature. And we have about 150 odd books. All of you authors that have authored recently, I request you to please send a copy of your book to the Derozio Research Center for posterity. One of the things I noticed as I was writing these books, many researchers came to me and said, where can I find information about this, about that? So by having a research center in India, in a central place, future researchers have a fund of information. So I hope it will grow. Little comment about today's Anglo-Indian world, my view. The second generation is very important. they're marrying out, they're being educated, they're getting really good jobs. And unlike my community that struggled to put bread and food on the table, could not get good employment. This is after the railway reservation ended in '57. This next generation is splendid, doing really well. Huge number of people are being educated. So it's very encouraging to go around India and see how well the community is doing. And my last comment there is the community is regaining middle class status. All right. That's about it. I hope I've done about 6 minutes.
You've done extremely well.
There we go. And thank you, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for that outstanding presentation. It's very enlightening. Thank you very much. We now move on to the next one. Anglo-Indians and Minority Politics in South Asia by Dr. Uther Charlton Stevens. Okay. So, Uther is the son of an Anglo-Indian father who migrated from Bangalore to the UK. He has been researching his father's community for 10 years. He did his PhD on Anglo-Indian history at the University of Oxford. He grew up in Hong Kong and is now teaching in Russia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Uther Charlton Stevens to speak to us today.
Thank you to the hosts and the organizers. I was strongly inspired to research Anglo-Indian history by my grandmother, who was one of these under-recognized women to whom Blair referred. A major in the Women's Auxiliary Corps India, a widow who managed to take her 3 children to the UK and managed to remain a teacher in the UK even without having to re-qualify by teaching at a Catholic school in England. And I was very inspired by her stories of life in towards the end of the British Empire in India, the late colonial period when she was a child, and the Second World War where she served. She was in Burma. She told me stories about how, inspired by a poem, she made a trip with a fellow officer to Kandahar. And so those stories about India, Burma, Afghanistan, the Second World War, they were really inspirational to me as a child, and I think that many Anglo-Indians are really good storytellers. So there's a culture of oral recounting of jokes and stories, which is very powerful within the Anglo-Indian community, and I think perhaps diluted in me, but I hope to give voice to some of that culture in the history that I write. I'm taking on a different challenge from Blair. I'm incredibly happy that there has been so much writing from within the community which presents views of the community, by the community, and for the community. But I'm also aware of the need, the really pressing need, to make academics and professors in top Indian and British universities take note of Anglo-Indians and treat our history seriously. So it's been my mission to try and write a very scholarly academic work which will compel any British or Indian historian who writes a history of the Raj not to ignore Anglo-Indians, as has often been the case. And I want people to take Anglo-Indian politics, the dimension of political history, seriously in its own right. The achievements of Anglo-Indian politicians in the late colonial period, Sir Henry Gidney and Frank Anthony are the most famous, are really very important and a major theme of my book. The way in which Anglo-Indians were enabled to secure reservations and nominated seats to the Lok Sabha and many of the state legislatures, that was really an incredible achievement. Given the fact that at the same time, following partition, they were getting rid of all the minority provisions in the constitution that protected the other larger minorities, the Sikhs, the Christians, the Muslims. They were losing their minority protection, even as Anthony managed to enlarge and enshrine Anglo-Indian rights in the constitution. Those provisions have had all manner of consequences, mostly good, and they've given Anglo-Indians a visibility in modern India that they wouldn't otherwise have. I'd just like to read like a few short excerpts, and I'll try, with respect to everyone, and my thanks to the hosts and the organizers, to keep within the time limits. But let me just share with you a few of the primary sources that I've found. And what I've done is mainly deep archival work. And at the very beginning, there was a lot of skepticism, even from sympathetic professors at Oxford, that it would be possible to find the source material. The source material doesn't exist, is what I was told. But slowly, painstakingly over years, I've built up a really large amount of material which we didn't expect to find. And it has snowballed. And actually now, I can go to the archive, look at a list of documents with numbers and codes and hardly any information, no clear indication that Anglo-Indians are mentioned there at all, and somehow mystically I feel the force and I realize this document, there, okay? And it's amazing. I get an 80% hit rate with this sort of mystical way of researching now. It's only because if you do anything long enough, and I've been working on this for 10 years, you get good at it, and you don't know how, but you learn how to do it. So let me just give you a few quotations. A lot of the early Anglo-Indian history, of course, was very wrapped up with the importance of the name. You know, well, what does it mean, Anglo-Indian? And the earlier names, Indo-Britain, Eurasian, East Indian, they were all really prominent in the politics of the 19th century. So in 1900, very famous Viceroy Lord Curzon met a delegation of Anglo-Indians, and he was a bit bemused that the group, which was still called Eurasians until the 1911 census, wanted to be called Anglo-Indians. So he said very haughtily, "The society which you represent has recently acquired a new name, the Imperial Anglo-Indian Association. The choice of this name is the latest phase in a long contention over the question of nomenclature that it would be best and wisest for you to adopt. I find the names Eurasian, East Indian, Indo-Britain, statutory natives of India, domiciled British and Europeans have all, at one time or another, to some extent, still are employed. It would appear to me that this has been regarded as a most vital question by many of your number, and that almost as much energy has been expended upon it as upon the practical discussion of the future. I do not myself see why there should be any deep and insidious sting in the name Eurasian as applied to persons of mixed blood, nor do I understand the great and widespread anxiety to discover a new label. Anglo-Indian is a phrase which is applied in popular acceptance to a particular individual in society. British is a rule in origin which spends its life official, professional, or otherwise in India, and as a rule finally goes home." So of course those were the old Anglo-Indians, and that's the way that the word Anglo-Indian is used in a lot of literature. Famous Passage to India, E.M. Forster using the old meaning, the British in India. But it was through the very fervent efforts of Anglo-Indian politicians that the name change took place. And it also took place in recognition of the great services which the imperial state relied upon Anglo-Indians to perform, to buttress the security of colonial rule in the strategically sensitive railways, telegraphs, customs positions. And I think we know, although sometimes some academic studies seem to focus on the poorer members of the community, that this was a community which, under British rule, enjoyed both privilege and British patronage and support, and were enabled to have quite high-level middle-class lifestyles in the middling rungs of the colonial employment hierarchy. But they were also at the same time subjects of socio-racial British snobbery, which another time I would love to have some more time to go into that with you and tell you some of the fascinating stories about how snobbish the British could be, not only towards Anglo-Indians, but towards each other. I was carrying boxes of my books here, and I'm sorry that they're quite unaffordable. My next book will be an affordable book and will have an Indian edition. This book I've had to write with a university academic press in order to give our subject the visibility that it needs amongst fellow professors at the leading universities in the West and in India. But carrying that large box of books here, I thought, well, I've become a boxwallah, which is exactly what the British used to say, the heaven-born ICS men used to say about the inferior British people who worked in trade. So the whole world of the colonial clubs and the gradations of social snobbery, which were in turn replicated, I would argue, within the Anglo-Indian community, especially in the late colonial period. There was all kinds of Anglo-Indian snobbery about different kinds of Anglo-Indians and their different status. Color was a factor, education was a factor, employment, pension grade. I heard somebody mentioning their pension earlier. That's always been important to Anglo-Indians. You know, do you have a good pension? And we also heard the term waster. I think my grandmother had an older, more Anglo-Indian term for that. She used to refer to them as loafers. And certainly she thought that parts of the family, even the parts of the family in the UK, were loafers. Don't mix with them, they're loafers, she'd tell me. So anyway, in order to stay within the bounds of time, I'll hand over to the next speaker, but I'd very much like to continue this conversation and to talk with you all about these fascinating stories that we can reconstruct from Anglo-Indian history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uda Charlton-Stevens, for making that the subject of your work very relevant and interesting for us listeners. Thank you very much. We now move on to our next author. He has a PhD from the University of Madras and has carried out full-fledged research on the Anglo-Indian identity. In his book, Black and White.
In the olden days, in the classroom, I used to speak extempore. But now I think I'm going to read what I wrote for all you people. Yes, I did write Black and White with the subtitle, The Anglo-Indian Identity in Recent English Fiction. This is a non-fictional book, so it's heavy reading. I have also written 2 fictional books, rather small. My first one called No Accident. It's a kind of a love story, as somebody described it. And the second is called Double O Quits, which is a compilation of 2 plays. One at least is Anglo-Indian. So, let me get down to it. I've called my, let's say, speech now, Why I Write. One of the most difficult questions is the simplest. Why? This is because the answer you provide may and can be thrown back at you. But why? And so may start an unending series of whys, liberally interspersed with the accompanying why not. If every question has its answer plain and simple, we would have no need for so many discussions that lead nowhere. But since we are now here and nowhere near the beginning of my speech, let me get straight to the point. I write for fun, even when I am more serious. I write for furthering the horizons of knowledge. I believe any human activity must have some deep purpose. And I write to improve my finances, since everything they say is a matter of money. But most of all, I write for myself. You don't have to believe everything I just said. Many people have had fun at my expense, calling into question my credibility, my style, my methodology, my gumption, my assumed inordinate pride. I accept their criticism, though all this is not really the business of criticism, and pass on, unflustered by the barbs and taunts and innuendo that comes my way. Any writer who has self-belief must also develop a thick skin, for his truth may not be to the liking of the public, since he must stand by his truth expressed in the written word, or be damned eternally. Black and White, the title of my third publication, came out in the year 2012, but it was begun in 1980 when I was an MPhil student. I was definitely the first Anglo-Indian student to be admitted to the Central University of Hyderabad. I hope I'm not the last. And when I undertook research into the work of the British writer called Scott, I also began a voyage of discovery, a voyage to explore the identity of the Anglo-Indian. This exploration became the core of my doctoral work, which finally resulted in a PhD in 2010 from the University of Madras. Black and White examines more than a dozen books on the Anglo-Indian theme written by Indians, Britishers, and Americans. It also looks carefully at the contributions of scholars and critics to the ongoing melee. In all cases but one, I found that writers and critics alike strived to make the Anglo-Indian characters in their stories, listen carefully, or in their pieces of supposedly critical writing, the most despicable, loathsome, fickle, fanciful, untrustworthy, treacherous, lecherous, amoral human beings to ever walk the face of the earth. Why? My guess is that the purity brigades on both the Indian and the other side just could not stomach the reality that they were indeed the progenitors of the abominable Anglo-Indian. I have different chapters for different categories of writers. The Insider deals with Anglo-Indian writers, namely Frank Anthony, I. Allen Seeley there, and Ruskin Bond. The Inside Outsider looks at the work of fellow Indian writers and finds nothing of note except in a short translated book by Ashoka Mitran. I must confess that the writing work was over by 2006, so I have not included any of the writers available here, I suppose. The Outside Insider examines some of the work of the other Anglo-Indian, the Englishman long resident in India. The Outsider focuses on books by writers who had no umbilical attachment to the country or the beleaguered community. In a chapter called The Critics, I call to account the willful and whimsical writings of people who should have known better. The conclusion offers suggestions for better research, for further research, and ends with the hope that the dark images of the past may finally be erased. Not too long ago, almost a year or so, I listened with amusement to the thought that for this reunion, more people from India, Anglo-Indians not accepted, should be brought in to speak about the community, since they supposedly knew and know us better. When the idea seeped into my brain, I was aghast. To believe that someone else knows you better than you do is plain wacky. It also returns to the stereotype. But then I realized very lately that this was the classical AI conundrum: to be or not to be. Indian. If way into the 21st century we are still considering options, we as a community are forever doomed. I am no spokesman for Frank Anthony, but he was spot on when he asserted that we are Indians. No other consideration will ever have precedence. Let me close with a positive note. My research supervisor for the MPhil degree was also interested in the Anglo-Indian question. In one of her published books on what was then called Indian writing in English, she examines the book Combat of Shadows by Manohar Malgonkar. The lead character in the book is a vivacious Anglo beauty whose name is Ruby Miranda. She is jilted by her English suitor, Henry Winton, but shows enough character to rebuff his continuing sexual interest. My mentor and revered guru, I might add, my MPhil supervisor, makes a comment in her analysis of the book that perhaps Ruby Miranda has lost out, quote, the abiding Anglo-Indian dream, unquote, the one that assumes that every single Anglo-Indian, in fiction as in real life, wants to escape the country of his or her birth. I draw attention to this unwarranted and uncorroborated bit of criticism in my book, knowing that my stricture would hit the mark. My guru, in a letter dated 10th March 2006, simply said, I accept the criticism you have of my comments. I wrote that book before I was 30, and I hope I have learned better since. I felt vindicated. I felt elated. One of the persons whose opinion mattered a great deal to me was gracious and human enough to admit her mistake and commit herself in writing. This is scholarship and ahimsa of the highest kind. The essential teaching of the great Indian texts is know thyself.
Say, I have been invited, I am an ordinary man invited by extraordinary people to the assembly of exemplary men. It shows you the generosity of Harry and Richard. The generosity of Richard and Harry means the generosity of this community as a whole. It is the generosity, your generosity is the thread of mercy and kindness. That's what I feel from the day I was delivered on this earth. You may ask, why do you talk like this and what fascinates you towards this community? There is an emotional attachment that I would like to express, because when I was delivered, the first human touch, of the hands the first human touch in the hands was that of an Anglo-Indian. Because my mother was attended by a lady doctor who happened to be an Anglo-Indian. She is no more. I hail from a place called Mayiladurai, 300 kilometers away from this place. It is on the river bank. It is on the banks of the river Kaveri, a fertile land of mainly an agricultural place. It is an orthodox place also. It is a land of feudal people. So, at that place, there was one lady doctor by name Dr. Rodriguez. I was christened by that lady. When I was delivered, it was a day of Arudra, the birth day of Lord Nataraja. Normally, this Lord Nataraja in small places, that idol will come through the streets. When I was delivered, when the lady doctor came out, she saw Lord Nataraja. She has asked my parents, my grandfather, Lord Nataraja has come. You christened the name, child by his name. That's why I am called as Nataraja. Still, I happen to know, I checked up with Rodriguez also, I wanted to write about that lady. She was a wonderful lady. I have seen her for many times. Whenever there was a delivery in the house, she used to come in a cot, not an ambassador car or something. She used to come in a cot. As a child, I have seen the serenity in her face. Till date, I say that serenity comes out of the true Christian belief. I have seen the same serenity on the many faces of the Anglo-Indian people, including my beloved friend Richard. That innocence you would feel from an Anglo-Indian. As a non-Anglo, I am telling you, if my words are not pleasant, kindly excuse me. I have a great respect for this community. I have seen many people, I have interacted with many people. When I joined as Superintendent of Customs in Chennai, Custom House, there were few superintendents and assistant commissioners from Anglo-Indian community. They will be treated as people who don't work. Actually, there was one officer by name Johnny Fernandez. Johnny Fernandez, an Anglo-Indian. 24 hours he will be in customs uniform. Even if he goes to a funeral, he will be in uniform with a tie. Very funny person. Even if he goes to a marriage house, he comes with a uniform. Nobody likes the uniform. I was all along I was in intelligence service, so I have not worn the uniform. Even my senior colleagues used to tell me that this fellow should not draw the allowance for uniform. He started to put on his uniform. But rather, this Johnny Fernandez, even for funerals, for marriages, he respects this uniform. He enjoys the uniform. This is why I am telling this gentleman, remembering the gentleman means it is the spirit of the Anglo-Indian community. That liveliness, the lovable community, the kindness, I would see the radiation of love and affection from the faces of this community, though it appears to be an island in the subcontinent. They don't mingle with the others. It was the time. It was the time, not now. They used to be spendthrift. They don't save money. It was their culture, not now. Presently, Richard will not spend not more than 50 rupees per day. There is one more lady, probably many of you may know. Her name was Mrs. Karen. She works for the Singapore Airlines. She may not bring the purse when we go for the canteen. This is the shift in the cultural aspect of the Anglo-Indian community. How the future will be is a big question. Now, as I am emotionally attached towards this community, I wanted to publish a book on this community. This is about 400 or 500 years old, even if you take into consideration about the French, the advent of French, Portuguese people in India. But the Tamil has got a rich literary heritage. It has got 2,000 years old history. Every year 10,000 books are published in Tamil. You just calculate the tons and roads of Tamil books which would have been published by this time, right from the year 1835, when Indians were allowed to publish books by the Britishers. Lakhs and lakhs of Tamil books are available, but this is the only first book on Anglo-Indian community. It was a search for a good history book on Anglo-Indian community. I used to disturb Richard for years together. This fellow used to be very funny. Then he took me to Harry one day. He gave me some issues of the magazines, Anglos on the window. But they are all contemporary matters. Then I used to insist on him. This is not the stuff what I want. It should be a cultural, it should be a document on the cultural aspect of the Anglo-Indian community. One night I stumbled upon one article in the internet that they classified it one of the 3 major classics. This book, the English title was Hostages to India, written by Herbert Stock. It was rated to be one of the best classics on Anglo-Indian community. Immediately I disturbed this fellow. He was in high temperature. It was 1 or 3 days. He was not able to speak. Then I didn't bother. You should get me this book. Then he said, no, don't worry, don't talk. I am in a bad shape. Tomorrow morning I will get you. Harry has got this book. Why have you not told me for the last 3 years? Then immediately this book, I got it. It was translated by my colleagues and edited by myself. It is a wonderful book in English. It is now available in the internet archives. Anybody can download, and it's a beautiful history on the Anglo-Indian community. This is the only thing what I have done, probably for which you might have invited me. Why this book has attracted the fine flow? Why this book has attracted me? There was one beautiful line. If England is our fatherland, India is our motherland. A beautiful line which attracted me. Throughout the passages of this book, you have a wonderful introspection on this community. So this I would like to finish. The last point I would like to add for this floor, that I consider now, even in my house, one of my relatives has married an American. He is a musician somewhere, an ordinary fellow. He came to my house. There is a grandfather. He is 104 years old. He blessed this American. This would not have happened 50 years before in my family. You would have been murdered. This shift in the cultural change throughout the world, we should welcome it. This was the first initiative was done by the Anglo-Indian people. So I will say the first blueprint for the digital era was drafted and designed by the Anglo-Indian people. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Mr. Natarajan. Our next author, she is a founding member of the New Zealand and South Asia Centre at the University of Canterbury, Christchurch. She graduated in religious studies, completed an MA in history, and is currently completing a PhD in New Zealand. Her publications include several articles and short stories about Anglo-Indian lives. Her work enlightens us about the Anglo-Indians of Pakistan, often considered a lost tribe. Please give our next author, Dorothy MacLure a warm welcome as she comes on stage to talk about Raj Days to Down Under. Dorothy.
Hi everybody. Can you see me? Okay. Anyway, it's lovely to be here, particularly not to thank. Okay, I just want to say it's a wonderful opportunity to see everybody here and be here with everyone. And one of the reasons I'm here is because reading about Anglo-Indians, and I obviously, as you can tell, am one. But the difference is I was born and raised in Pakistan. However, when I first started reading the books in New Zealand, so far away from India and England where there's much more, people said to me, there's nothing here, there's no evidence about what you're trying to say, it's different. So another person said, how about gathering the evidence? So what really I am is an oral historian. I do interviews. I have an agenda as to what I want to know, and I originally, because I grew up in Rawalpindi, which is near Islamabad, what you might know. Islamabad wasn't built in those days when I was there. It was only started in about the 60s, probably late 50s. So I looked for my parents' generation, who could remember the twilight years of the Raj, what it was like at partition, which of course being right there in the border between Lahore and Amritsar and all the trains. Sorry about this. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, and so I started originally with my parents' generation, recording the stories. 1996 probably, I began. I remember Beatrice reviewed my book a long time ago. But basically it's not my book, it's the people I interviewed, their stories. And because I live in New Zealand, I focused on the ones who came to New Zealand. I actually recorded a lot of my relatives' stories as well. What it was like living in the Raj days, what it was like at partition, why they left, what it was like resettlement. And then the people started dying because they had to be born before 1930s at the latest to remember those 147 days. And I started being approached to come and talk at funerals so the grandchildren would know what their life story was like. So what I did, all the stories, interviews, are oral histories in the archives, and I typed full transcripts. I've written a few articles, but I produced this book for the families. I love the picture. Excuse me, I have to hold this one. I like the back cover as much as the front cover, with the tail of the leopard. It's a lady who died last January 99, nearly, in Christchurch, New Zealand. So it was privately issued by me as a heritage book for the families, which actually went down very nicely. And it's been out of print. I issued it twice. And about 3 years ago, I ran out. And it's too expensive for New Zealand, $40 just to print, let alone the postage. So Harry is somewhere around. Thank you, Harry. Wonderful new cover with a whole array, a montage of the different interviewees, or some of them. A lot of them are still alive. We meet every 3 months and have a lunch together, or samosas or curry puffs and lovely things like that. So really, there were 30 people I interviewed in New Zealand. One withdrew his story because they're not happy. Not everyone wants to have their whole personal detailed links. It's one thing in the archives, it's another to have it read by relatives and friends. So I allowed them to, I took out all the questions, so it's really 29 autobiographies. It's their own voices speaking. A lot of people didn't like the written word and the way they spoke, but my favourite story is an elderly friend in New Zealand who read it and said it was like having a conversation with 29 different people because it's their voices telling the stories. And I've got photographs of each of them. And I must admit, I'm just so delighted to have it available again online at half the price and less than what it was available in New Zealand. And I'm so grateful to Anglo-Indian, Harry, and I know his whole team will work with him. So basically, what do I want to say about this? The Anglo-Indian autobiographies. And the difference is it will tell you about things like the train drivers, Brian Birch, whose family is here on the cover. His father was a train driver from Peshawar coming down the line, the Northwestern Railways, and the train would be stopped with either a wire tied across the cuttings or a long placed over the railway lines. So I asked him, how did they stop the train? And he explained to me. And then, of course, all the passengers were slaughtered physically, horribly. And I think they're unique stories to show how the Anglo-Indians were loyal to whoever they were working for. Frank Anthony talks a lot about the people in service in India. He doesn't talk about the ones in Pakistan. People I've interviewed, some of them were brothers. For example, Flight Lieutenant Blunt, who turned up in Kashmir, one of the first planes to land in Kashmir in 1947-48. His brother was in Pakistan in the boundary police. So you look, and the stories just continues. And right after the 1971 war, there are people in Pakistan who you've heard about fighting against the war. On the other side, Anglo-Indians serve Pakistan and India. They are loyal to whoever they were with, even though a lot migrated, probably for those reasons. The 1965 war particularly made a lot immigrate. They didn't want to be fighting each other. They were siblings, cousins, and relatives in both armies, very senior positions. And the interesting thing in Pakistan is there's no definition. People didn't know about the definitions. There's no reservations. But they all got schooling, they had a good education, and the jobs were good. And my book is divided into 3 areas. There's 29 stories. I've got the Northwest stories, the people from Chennai, Pakistan. The Bengal stories, which is my father's family were around in Bengal. Mother's family was in Punjab. And then a few Anglo-Burmese stories, a couple of Parsis, and some people from central India. And all I can say as a finale is there's not a lot of you here who aren't academics who don't write, but record your own stories. When I started, it was analog tapes, cassettes, typing physically each of the transcripts. Now you can do it on your telephone, you can plug it in, get a transcript typed out, edit so easily. The more, like Blair Williams did, I started about the same time as Blair, collecting the stories. And I think the more people do it, the more evidence people like Luther, who are younger, working in the field, have this evidence to show the diversity. We're not, in Pakistan by 1950, very few were in the railways. They'd all gone on to other jobs. Because there's reservations here, and there was a much larger community for a start. You get a different dimension when you have a larger number of people. So it's very interesting, but the Pakistanis loved it there, and in fact, I've heard of the O'Brien family talking about how quite a few have converted, but in fact, quite often it's a nominal conversion because of the present day situation, but they love staying there and they have become Pakistanis the same way as Anglo-Indians in India, as has been asked. They should be proud to be Indians. However, my book is about the diaspora, so my children are New Zealanders. I can't help it. Their married fathers are New Zealander, they're Americans to other people. And I kind of think that recording your own stories, putting them in some archive, would be a fantastic thing to do for everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dorothy, for talking to us about that lovely book. Great, so swiftly moving on. He is also from New Zealand. Our next author is a teacher who writes for national newspapers, literary journals, and anthologies. He has won various awards, including one for The Secret Vindaloo. This book is a recipe of rare entertainment value. But let Keith spell it out as you keep smacking your lips. Or is he going to talk about his brand new book, Ishq? Well, I'll leave that to Keith, and please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Keith Buckley.
Sorry, it's a bit of a moving feast. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you so much for coming today. I especially owe a vote of thanks to another moving feast, and that's having cleared. So, to start off with, greetings audience. I'm aware the day has been very long for you. So, very much like King Henry VIII, who said to his wife, "I shall not keep you long." I'm down to talk about The Secret Vindaloo, but I'm really here to devote my time to my latest book, Ishq, which is available at all fine bookstores like Anglo-Indian. And as far as TSV goes, The Secret Vindaloo, it really uses Anglo-Indian food, particularly Vindaloo, as a deep metaphor for the retrieval of a personal and communal history. And when writing about ourselves, it's really dangerous to valorize our history. That's a problem with fiction writers. We seek to redress the past, but we can edge into fetishing our own representations. And so TSV is offered as an affectionate parody of our lives. I now turn to Ishq. I'll consider the fragment and read. I'll consider the preface with some thoughts and read a fragment of one story. I like to think of a concept called Zalindos. It's not on the map as we know maps, but it's in my headspace. An imaginary land without boundaries carved out by my three significant stays: New Zealand, India, and Australia, all morphing into a single experience. In order to make sense of these times, I turned to Zalindos to mine my writings. Now, this anthology, Ishq, is a collection of fictions and essays, old and new, that are meditations and mediations of Zalindos. Be they about a mother, daughter, a coming of age, marriage, ownership of land, heartbreak, same-gender love, which I think is a very, very important thing to include in our compilations about our own stories. It's been a marginalized part. There are some writers who've covered it, but I'm very pleased that it's included in this book. I am not in the position to have written that, but I asked a friend to write it, and it's in the compilation, and it's called Farhan. And if you were to ask me, I think that's the best part of it, and you can ignore my stories over there. So, Ishq, the Arabic for love, is the word that really came to me. There's this PR and this love, but this Ishq, and I thought that was such a wonderful word, and I used it to head up the book. Now, the context of the story is Ishq, is that, as you know, Dr. Robin Andrews is my wife, and sometimes I feel that as though that I'm Mrs. Robin Andrews. But we travel a lot, and that means I go to conferences and sit in the front row, and sometimes it's not hard for me, it's very hard for me to listen to some stuff. My wife has given me strict orders not to say anything, but I bridle. You could very well call this bridling. So one of the things I've asked the lovely lady over here is to just scroll up, because there's two registers in this story. One of the registers, keep going, this is the best part, the blank part. Now, and if you just go a little bit further up, you'll see what I mean. So just there. So the story has two registers. One of the registers is like a commentary, the other is an interiorization of what I'm really feeling. I sat in the front row of the auditorium reading a banner behind the lectern. And my 8 minutes starts now, will it? No, okay. Calcutta University, 2015 International Conference 5. Identity, Indian or Anglo-Indian. At the lectern, an anthropologist, saffron sari clad, orange bindi on forehead, vermilion in the parting of her hair, pressed a button on a handset, and an overhead screen read, "An Anglo-Indian means a person whose father or any other of whose male progenitors in the male line is or was of European descent, but who is domiciled within the territories of India and is born within such territory of parents habitually resident therein and not established there for temporary purposes only. And now I go to the italics as well as I was feeling. As an Anglo-Indian, I live two lives. I live one by definitions authored by others about who I am, how I will conduct myself, and the other in the gaps between definitions. The first is solitary confinement, and the other, yippee! Warming to her theme, the anthropologist continued. As because Anglo-Indians were neither English or Indian, nor fish nor fowl, they kept to themselves and did not mix with other Indians. As per my thesis refers the latent, guilty, I'm an Anglo-Indian, sorry for living. But the proposition from the academy, we don't mix with other Indians, I immediately thought of Denzel and Sita. These two were not short on mixing. All they do was gas on, buck, 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 buck. In the Grisho, summer of 1969, Denzel Lewis and I were trainee students at St. Thomas's Teachers Training College, Kidapur, Calcutta. The institution, established in 1789, the oldest school in the city, occupies the former summer retreat of a Governor General of British India, Sir Warren Hastings. The school grounds reflected the grandiose contours of the British Raj, light forests once stocked with deer, colonial buildings with white flagstone staircases leading to Ionic and Doric pillared porticos, interior winding wooden staircases, high ceilings with fans, their blades swirling lazily. In one of these buildings was a staff room, and the first I knew about Denzel's love life was when I spied a letter lying side on in his pigeonhole. It had the acronym SWAC, sealed with a kiss, in psychedelic colors on the back. It's how we courted in those days. It had to be from Sita. That's how she started with me. By the time I'd read her note to me, I was crazy for her, but I hardly knew the dame. That's how we referred to girls then. And somewhere in my head, I admit I was unsure. After all, she was full Indian, and I part. She Hindu, and I Catholic. The next time I walked down the path, I spotted her in the distance and took a closer gander. Her school uniform seemed too large, as though it was brought off the rack and dropped over her like a gunny sack. Unlike some of my Anglo girls, who in spite of matron's eagle eye, managed to turn up the hem of their skirts. It was a shy first date. She smelled of India, of monsoons, of the sun on her all day. This may appear silly to say, but she always smelled warm, as though she had her own body temperature. Warm and brown, Alice band in her long hair, slightly bushy eyebrows, wide apart faces, wide apart eyes, faint down on her cheeks, nice and tall. Denzel must have known that before him. I was friendly with her. Friendly, such an Anglo-Indian euphemism for a relationship. The English language is a hybrid beast. Sorry, down. I lost it, never mind. The English, was it there?
It was there.
It was there, sorry, my mistake.
It's all right, keep going. No.
It's okay, don't worry. I'm not for that. The English language is a hybrid beast. I was buying chutney in the bazaar when a tugboat escaped from the choki, ran amok and killed a boxfella for his loot, creating a hullabaloo and landing himself in the Mulgatani. However, oral traditions keep their secrets, and with patois blabbed to dictionaries, everyone would know if Sita used the pungi pill. I do not call up Denzel as though I'm doing table rapping. He comes to me and drops into my mind in different ways, almost like turning up for a cup of chai and gas. Sita sometimes accompanies him in the school and other stuff, so my memory of their story is randomly arranged, like peering into a tin tube Indian kaleidoscope at a show of shaken colored glass shards. No rhyme or reason to their offering. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Steve. That was interesting. That was fun. Let's move on now to our next author. Her stories, essays, and travel articles have been widely published across the world. She has also won an award for the Best International Travel Writer. Any guesses who we're talking about? Her book, Haunting India, is a collection of short fiction, poems, travelogues, and personal memoirs, and is a very realistic account of living in India. Would you please welcome to the stage our next author, Margaret Default.
Well, I have to thank Harry MacLure right at the start because he's been amazing. Known him him and Gillian for quite a while, and it's been a pleasure and privilege, Harry. And Gillian, I'm not sure where she is, but anyway. And Haunting India, which is a compilation of short stories and memoir, was published by Blair Williams to begin with. Well, not just to begin with, but it was one of the early books that he published. And I owe him a debt of gratitude as well. I'm not sure where he is, he's escaped somewhere. But anyway, what I'm going to do is read an excerpt from one of the chapters of the book. It's shortened to a fair extent, so I hope I'm able to keep within the time limit. If not, please forgive me. Anyway, it's called Chasing Ghosts in Bombay, and it's back in 1987. I'm walking down Bombay's Colaba Causeway behind a young woman with a beehive hairstyle. She wears a cotton t-shirt, 6-day style, pedal pushers, and sandals. I follow as she makes her way past Leopold Cafe, Grand Bazaar, and Barter's Shoe Shop. Car horns beep and hawkers bawl over the noise of traffic. The woman ahead of me stops, turns around and looks at me. Her eyes are empty of recognition, for she doesn't know me. And although she's mute, I sense the question, why are you following me? I struggle to answer but can't articulate the words. She has my face when I was 25. For the young woman standing on the crowded sidewalks of my yesterdays, the future is a series of mirrors angled into blankness, and the person she will become in the years ahead doesn't exist. Which of us is real? Which is the hologram? I wake up abruptly, chuck aside the duvet, and get out of bed. I tiptoe to the living room and stare out of the window. The dream is still vivid in my waking consciousness. The afternoon glare and confusion of Colaba Causeway lying superimposed over a moonlit, snow-quilted lawn in Surrey, Canada. Does homesickness affect all first-generation immigrants? Not necessarily. But I feel as though I'm shackled to a sphere which refracts images from two different worlds as it spins from darkness into light and back into darkness again. Then, now. Then, now. The then of India, the now of Canada. I inhabit both and neither. Will going back to India cure my fever? Whether it does or not, I know I have to return. I have to taste, smell, and feel the grit of India. I have to turn over and examine the minutiae of remembrance. It takes more than one journey, as it turns out. The first trip is in 1987. My children, Glenn, age 17, Susan, 40, accompany me while my husband spends a holiday with his family in Britain. He has no desire to return to India. All that racket, the heat and the flies, he says, and masses of people, no thanks. He can't understand that those are the very things I crave in my sterile Canadian surroundings. We touched down at Santa Cruz Airport It is late afternoon, and as I walk out onto the tarmac, India rushes up to me. The air is hazy with wood smoke from suburban slum tenements, and although it's November, I feel as though a moist Turkish towel lies warm across my face. I take a slow, deep breath. I'm back, at last. In India, fetid, earthy, teeming, cacophonous India. We board a rickety Ambassador black and yellow taxi and take off with a clashing of gears and a flurry of dust. That first ride is a revelation to my teenagers. They're silent, both of them glued to the windows, beyond which lies the whole cataclysmic, roaring energy of the city. Its huddled shanties, concrete skyscrapers, pawn-beauty shops, its steaming sidewalks, and stray cattle. The driver leans on his horn, overtakes trucks on the wrong side, inches between surging pedestrians, and thrums his fingers on the steering wheel in time to a blast of Hindi movie from his radio. Like my kids, I'm silent too. A silence born of euphoria. This is no dream. I'm back in Bombay, and the familiar landmarks are out there. We drive past the Mahalakshmi Racecourse, Marine Drive, Chowpatty Beach, now dotted with evening strollers, and on to our lodgings at the Y in Colaba. Our rooms are Spartan. The walls are scabrous with peeling plaster, and the beds hard and unyielding as a stepmother's lap. But there are no cockroaches. The toilet works, so does the fan, and beyond the little concrete balcony, crows bicker and parrots screech a requiem to the dying day. I pour myself a libation of rum and thumbs up before we all fall into an exhausted sleep. It has been almost a 24-hour trip from Vancouver Airport and 1,000 light years journey into a completely different world. As the days unfurl, I wonder, what is the wraith of my past? I look for her in the places we once lived. Here's our apartment building in Colaba, its grey stone exterior set foursquare against the passage of time. As it did back in the early 60s, up on the fourth floor veranda overlooking the street, I fancy that the ghost of my childhood self might still be there, watching the crowds entering the foyer of the Regal Cinema across the street. But she isn't. The veranda is empty. The sphere of time has rotated forward. The past has been subsumed into the shadows. Nevertheless, I push the sphere into reverse rotation as we pause before St. Andrew's Church, where all those many years ago, Leon and I emerged out of the front portico as husband and wife. We posed for christening photos, taken in the same spot, with Glenn and later Susan held in the arms of my younger self, flanked by my husband and leaving parents. All of us seeking to freeze the moment forever. All the old familiar places are subtly changed, but still there. Still there, like the dignified facade of Victoria Terminus, where my father's office continues to exist in an adjoining wing. There, like the Metro Cinema, the Jahangir Art Gallery, the Afghan Church, all of them witnesses to the flotsam and jetsam of my days and nights of those many years ago in Bombay. As guests of old friends, we bring in the new year at the Catholic Gym on Marine Drive. The crowds file in, and acquaintances whom I've lost touch with over the years pause to greet, to hug and reminisce. The band strikes up, and in the deja vu of the moment, I look at the stage, half expecting to see Goody Sarvai or Nelly swinging a piano accordion, backed by drums, guitar, double bass. But they've all faded into the past. Even so, their replacements continue to play music of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This land is your land, this land is my land. the ladies of Calcutta, they do something to me. Come to Bombay, come to Bombay. Bombay very high. I've swept onto a dance floor jammed with people. We jive, waltz, tango, and foxtrot. Sweat-soaked collars are loosened. High-heel shoes are surreptitiously eased off under the table between dancers. The hum of conversation rises and falls. And all the while I search for her. Strafe the crowds for the doppelganger of my youth. For surely she's here somewhere. Is that her, the young woman wearing a blue taffeta gown and stiletto-heeled shoes, slipping shadow-like between the dancers? Do I catch a glimpse of her doing the cha-cha-cha? Or is she the girl laughing over her shoulder as she yo-yos in the jive? It is almost midnight. Everyone is on the dance floor now. Groups are linked arm to arm in circles. Clockwise we go. Should old acquaintance be forgot? The MC counts down the seconds. 7, 6, 5, 4. A young woman breaks into the circle. She holds my hand and I turn to look at her. She has my face when I was 25. She smiles, her eyes holding mine. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year, everyone. I feel her breath on my cheek as she hugs me. We, she and I, meld into one another as the rotating sphere halts for a nanosecond and then moves on. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was absolutely lovely. And thank you for being such a wonderful audience here. And we've now come to the last one, our 17th author for today. He studied in one of the most reputed colleges in India, St. Stephen's, Delhi University, and worked in Canada, USA, New Zealand, and Australia. One of his novels was shortlisted for the 1998 Booker Prize. His first novel, The Trotter Nama, was published in 1988 and tells the fascinating story of 7 generations of an Anglo-Indian family. We are grateful for his presence with us today. Yes, we're talking about none other than the award-winning, internationally renowned author, Alan Seeley. Please put your hands together as I call him on stage.
And thanks to Harry and Richard for having me here. Well, you guys all, and one cannot say nay. If I had said nay, I would be sitting under a woolly hat in Dehradun, freezing my butt off. So I'm very glad I came. But don't ever be number 17 on the list. It's hell. Okay. I was going to read you a little bit about 3 breakfasts, but I'm going to abbreviate that now to 2 breakfasts. One breakfast is in the 18th century, and it's in the home of the great trotter, the first trotter of that 7-generation family, which is actually a history of the Anglo-Indians, which links a lot of historical figures in a fictional way, and tends to laugh at history as it's properly told. The narrator is a fat man who's in love with food. Okay. The first trotter is a Frenchman who comes to India and makes a big fortune in the city of Lucknow, and he's the good friend and also the employee of the Nawab of Awadh. And one day he decides to invite him for breakfast. He has a valet by the name of Fonseca, who represents the Portuguese element. And Fonseca is not just his barber and his storyteller, but he's also his private musician. And he has to provide the music for this breakfast. He plays the trumpet, and I start with a passage where the great trotter turns to Fonseca and says, "Now, what are you going to play?" And Fonseca tells him, "Eine kleine Nachtmusik at breakfast?" "Well," says Fonseca, who had been studying music, not German. But then it was too late. The Nawab's trumpet sounded. There was little conversation to mar the breakfast. The great trotter met the Nawab at the gunpowder door and conducted him on a brief tour of the main building. But both men were happy to abandon pretenses and proceed directly to the dining hall. Justin showed his guest to the chief seat at the MacLure end and made a remark about the weather. The Nawab agreed, his eyes skipping gently from cover to cover on the table before him. Words failing, the host walked the length of the board to the old armory end. A gong was struck and eating commenced. In fact, the Nawab had already taken advantage of Justin's turn back. With extra leaves inserted in the table, conversation was in any case impracticable. Even without the music, it would have been necessary to shout if one wanted to be heard at the other end. Between settings, while the table was being cleared of its wreckage, the commander-in-chief would amble over to his guest and employer and exchange a word. Then the second setting was ready, with a change of flowers to marigolds at the Nawab's end and daffodils at the great trotter's. Justin returned to his seat, and the musicians at his end struck up a mid-morning rag. The Frenchman loves Indian music, and the Nawab fancies himself a European. The music was loud enough to drown out the meal cheese singing. His fortune is based on indigo. When the meal was over, Justin smoked his hookah, and the Nawab his Dutch cigars. Out of politeness, they exchanged their smoking apparatuses for a minute. The waiters saw to it that neither device was lit for this ceremonial interview, and the two men simply sat there sucking vacantly for a space before returning to their favored tobaccos. I'm abbreviating this as I read. Second breakfast is in the 19th century, and it is breakfast at Dr. Bellow's School, Madras. This is an orphanage. Sunday, tyre and rice. Monday, tyre and rice. Tuesday, tyre and rice. Wednesday, tyre and rice. Thursday, tyre and rice. Friday, tyre and rice. Saturday, tyre and rice. Tires, they. We come from the north, sorry. Okay, I'm just going to skip right to the end. This is, oh, so that was 18th century, a little bit of the 20th century. A real school, Dr. Bell's in Madras, by the way. And now, right at the end of one of the later generations, I come to 1929. It's that era between the wars when this chap is a movie producer, and he has started his career in the silent films, and so he moves with sort of jerks. You remember the old movies. And then it moves into from the silent era into the talkies. He's a filmmaker and a bit of a dandy. Alex went back to the dressing room and looked in the mirror. He decided, getting on. It was no longer possible to blame the crazing of the mirror silver. The fact was that under each eye there had appeared a pouch, like a coin purse, finely netted with wrinkles. The eyes themselves were dull,
4 anna bits, and the slack oval mouth, though wet and pink, along the slightly jutting lower lip, was cracked and dry at the corners. The folds of his neck were puckered like the skin on boiled milk. So he starts to steal his wife's cosmetics. And over the next year, he gets younger and younger and she gets older and older. A bottle of almond oil, newly opened one week, was gone by the next. In the bathroom, the cap was sometimes left off the bottle of hair dye. The sloping point on the lipstick had been blunted by a heavy hand. And every day, Alex looked younger. The jerkiness went out of his movements. And although the color had not yet probably come back into his clothes, there were days when the shock of his electric blue would be felt across a crowded room. This is his wife, but he has had a lover, and his lover was the heroine of his first film. And she was loosely based on Merle Oberon, who, as you know, was an Anglo-Indian who pretended that she had come from the Falkland Islands. She claimed that sort of lineage. In this book, I call her Pearl, and she has a twin sister called Ruby, who's the darker, right? So Pearl and Ruby. And I'm just going to read one paragraph and then I'm done. Pearl arrived in London just in time for the talkies. So she's made the shift from Calcutta and she's come to London, presumably from the Falklands. Unlike her drunken older brother and failed priest, she had no trouble finding her destination. The Pinewood Studios were her destiny. She was taken there by an important person who, on the voyage home, had preferred to keep his name confidential. Lord Greenham introduced her to an up-and-coming director in need of a swan-necked, raven-haired maiden for his projected Dracula. The part made no unreasonable demands on her talent. Pearl had simply to lie there and be bitten. People wanted a little blood, the director declared. It had been a long peace. And so there's that period between the First World War and the Second World War. And that's when the silent movies were becoming talkies. The shot was tastefully done, with 2 tiny pomegranate seeds set like a jeweled clasp on Pearl's toothsome neck. It was a sensation. People fought bloody battles for tickets, and for months afterwards, biting and being bitten were the rage. The next year, Pearl took elocution lessons. And the year after that, she made her first talkie. She took the script to heart, agonizing over the crucial scene in front of a mirror lit with 29 60-watt bulbs. Should she say, Ricardo? Or, Ricardo? That was the question. Then again, she might say, Ricardo! Or even, Ricardo. In the end, she simply said, Ricardo, and fell into his arms. It was a triumph of understatement. War clouds were threatening, and people were tired of histrionics. After that, when people had nothing to say, they said, Ricardo, and fell into one another's arms.
Just one announcement before we give out our mementos, and that is on behalf of Harry. He would like to say that his cherished book of Anglo-Indian ghost stories is out, it's ready, and for those of you who wish to buy it, it's on sale. And on that note, I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers. You really made our day, and this reunion one to remember. And we would like to honor you each with a memento. And may I request Dr. Beatrix D'Souza to distribute these mementos one by one to our speakers.
Thank you.
Have Karen Martin over, please.
I'd like to have your first poem, the one you read at the beginning. Oh, right.
Thank you. Shri Kumar Verma.
Congratulations. I know you are suffering.
Sangeeta Shinde T. We'll go on to Noel Thomas. Mr. S. Mutai isn't here, so may I call upon Glenn De Cruz. Thank you, Glenn. Daman Singh, can we have Daman Singh over?
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Daman. Brigadier Mike Balla. Thank you, Brigadier. We have Blair Williams. Thank you, Blair. Dr. Yutha Charlton Stevens. Thank you, Yutha. Dr. Brian Pepin. Thank you, Brian. Mr. M. Natarajan.
Your talk was very good.
We have Dorothy McMenamin over, please.
Let's get your progress. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Keith Butler.
Thank you very much. Ishq is a more chaste book than the Vindaloo.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Can we have Margaret D. Foles?
Beautiful excerpt which you read. I have the book, you have your book. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Mr. Alan C.D.
To Ricardo.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks again, Dr. D'Souza.